Greetings and welcome to the Hilaritas Press podcast, where we explore the vast world of Robert Anton Wilson. In this episode, I chat with teacher, writer, and longtime friend of Bob, Eric Wagner, about his just released second book, Straight Outta Dublin. I first encountered Eric in the late 90s in the Usenet group alt.fan.ra Wilson, and then later on as charter members of the Maybe Logic Academy. Eric's first book, An Insider's Guide to Robert Anton Wilson, came out in 2004. This second book explores James Joyce's influence on Robert Anton Wilson and includes a lengthy companion essay by Robert Anton Wilson scholar Michael Johnson. And so, right here, right now, it is my great pleasure to share with you my conversation with repeat guest, Eric Wagner. So, Eric Wagner, welcome back to the Hilaritas podcast and what I think is either your third or your fourth episode, depending on fifth. And one of those has not been released yet, and this will probably go out before that one does, but we hope to get them both out this spring. So anyway, welcome.
Welcome.
And so this time we're here to talk to you about your book, which this podcast will be released when that book releases. It'll be, what is it, Straight Outta Dublin?
Yes, sir.
Is there a subtitle to it?
Robert Anton Wilson and James Joyce.
Oh, well, there you have it. What you just told me before we started here that you've been working on this for 25 years. How does it feel to be done?
Tuned to a natural E. Part of me can't believe it, and I've gone through different responses to the text. Ross has done such wonderful work on this, and I really appreciate it. Michael Johnson's done wonderful work on this. I really appreciate it. But the last time I was reading through Ross's version and saying, yeah, everything looks good, although Michael found more mistakes. I like the book. I think what I've done on it, what Michael's done on it, I think Dr. Wilson would have felt pleased to see his love of Joyce so thoroughly documented.
Nice. And as you told me earlier, one of the things Wilson suggested you write this book because people might not appreciate the link between his work and Joyce.
Yeah, and so,
Go ahead.
My wife last century encouraged me to write about Dr. Wilson, and Michael Johnson encouraged me to write about Dr. Wilson. And so I started working on it, and I asked Bob what he thought. He said, well, yeah, it's okay if you do it as long as you let me help. So he was very wonderful answering questions. This is by email back then, this is like in 98, 99. And I got to see, Richard Bandler was bringing him to Southern California to do NLP seminars back then. And so he gave one in Anaheim in 2000, and I got to go down there, and Dr. Bandler was very nice, let me attend part of the NLP stuff with Bob. And I was talking to Bob about, what you would like what would I like me to focus on in my first book? And he said, the influence of Joyce, I don't think people appreciate that enough. Interestingly, here in 2025, somebody just posted on one of the Facebook Bob Wilson groups, why do we find Bob's books in the science fiction section of the bookstore? And I found that interesting because I haven't seen a Bob Wilson book in a bookstore for years. But he didn't like that, he would get put in the New Age section or whatever. I'm sorry, my earbud just dropped out. My apologies. what little attention he got in the 80s and 90s was from science fiction zines, or new age type people, on different places. And here we find ourselves in 2025. I a few academic sources mention Dr. Wilson, but he certainly doesn't get the attention of, say, someone like Pynchon. But anyway, I was working simultaneously on Insider's Guide and doing a master's degree. And wrote a couple papers in graduate school that ended up as appendices in that book. And one of them I expanded into my master's thesis, which was the influence of Finnegan's Wake on Robert Anton Wilson's Vast Illuminati. Looking back, it seems to me like a bad thesis topic that the advisory board at Cal State San Bernardino, I had to go through literally 23 versions of my proposal because they didn't want me writing about Robert Anton Wilson, but they eventually let me do it. So that my thesis came out at the same time my first book came out. And then in 2006, I was communicating with Dr. Wilson and said, what should I do for my second book? Here are a couple ideas. Maybe I could expand this into a full-length book. He said, yeah, I like that idea best. And so, as you and I were talking about beforehand, while I was working on my thesis, everything was about Joyce and Wilson. I was listening to Joyce and Wilson's tapes in the car. If I did anything other than that, I felt guilty. And so then I said, I'm going to make this a full book. And so for the last 20 years, if I wasn't working on this book, I felt guilty. Now read War and Peace a couple of times, did this, that, and the other thing. But that's been, at least part of me has been trying to get this thing done. And one thing, a question I asked Bob in like 98 was whether he based the five-fold structure of Masked Illuminati on the five-fold structure of Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He said, no, he based it on the Illuminati theory of history, which there's an appendix about in Illuminatus, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, parenthesis, paralysis. Although in a later take, he says it's thesis, antithesis, thesis, paralysis, paresis, a disease that you get from venereal disease. And so I said I would base my book on Wilson and Joyce on that five-fold structure.
How did that go? Do you find it, I'm curious, it seems like a challenge to kind of force a book into a structure like that, in my mind.
Yes, but I like it. I think it worked. So I had done the thesis project. I'd gone through, got an academic degree, started teaching community college, all that sort of good stuff. So my antithesis was to say, I'm outside of the academy. What is outside of the academy, which is where Wilson functionally exists for the most part. How do I respond to Joyce and Wilson there? Synthesis, going through that. Paralysis, I think, is perfect because Joyce saw paralysis as the central theme of his collection of short stories, Dubliners. Okay. The idea of people feeling trapped. You see that in all these different stories, the idea of paralysis. And then the question, that you have these two different models of even what the five stages are from Wilson, it seems like a very Wilsonian way. So that I have my thesis, my antithesis, my synthesis, and the next section is either parenthesis or paralysis, and the last section is either paralysis or paresis. So it's sort of like the book grew into that through all my difficulties writing it. And I really like introducing each of those five sections. I have like quotes about these ideas that I've sort of accumulated over the last quarter century, from Jerry Garcia to Joyce scholars to all sorts of other things that I thought fit into this.
Where does Jerry Garcia have to say about Joyce?
Look, Jerry liked Illuminatus. He particularly liked the idea of katmas as opposed to dogmas. So because again, it's the whole Eris thing was a Bay Area thing. Also, Bob and Jerry had the same chiropractor.
Oh, wow.
Either in Santa Cruz or somewhere thereabouts. Um, but there's Dick's Picks 8, the acoustic set. They're tuning up, and Jerry says, "Everybody just relax, man. We got you all night long." And I just sort of thought that sort of fit in with this, wrestling, wrestling with Joyce. People do it in so many different ways. I love the quote the literary critic Harold Bloom said: "Joyce rewards you however much effort you put into it." So I know a lot of academic PhDs who've like read Finnegan's Wake once. They've read Ulysses once. They said, did it, boom.
Check.
That seems sort of strange to me because I've read these books many times and I have no clue. But it's like the more you study it, the more you get out of it. Joyce designed it. It's like you dig deep, deep, he's going to reward you in deep ways. Bob is, I think, one of the things why Bob kept coming back to it throughout his life. One thing I was struck by in your wonderful recent talk with Bob Campbell, in the late 90s, early 2000s, would Bob have preferred it if he had lots of money to have written novels? And you could be well right. It seemed to me in his correspondence, he seemed most enthusiastic about Tale of the Tribe. And he really loved digging deep into Joyce and Late Pound. And I think that especially after Arlen's passing and as he had health challenges, he didn't have the energy to finish that. But that's the writing part. And he would often send out emails, oh, I want to write this, I want to write that, I want to write this. Yeah. Overwhelmingly nonfiction projects.
That's true.
Although earlier in the 90s, we had talked about, I had just went back and reread all his fiction in the order it takes place. Going back to Earth Will Shake all the way up through Bride of the Illuminatus, the fragment we have. And he said, yeah, I always wanted to cover the whole overarching history. But other than that comment, which might have been 96, 95, I don't remember him talking about writing fiction after that.
Okay, interesting.
But again, energy, and response, if he had the sort of response that Dan Brown had, he might have just written novels. I don't know.
I think, and I said this when I was talking to Bob, but that it was a conversation Michael Johnson and I had a long time ago where he had speculated that Bob would really want to write fiction. However, and I also wonder, like Tale of the Tribe to me was almost like his opus, so to speak. If he could put it all into one package, all the interesting people that influenced his lives and what his view of the future was, that it would be Tale of the Tribe. But I'm just kind of going off impressions. You're about to say something.
It's interesting because I once talked to him about writers who did that, wrote their magnum opus at the end of their life. I said, I wonder if you're going to do that. And he said, no, I don't have time for it. So, I don't know. Yeah, that was in the late 90s, maybe before he started working on Tale of the Tribe. But it's like, there's a bit, the Hindu masters would say, neti, neti, not that, not that. A lot of times with Bob, and I keep dropping my earbud, my apology. I would say something to him. He'd say, no, that's not what I meant. Not what I meant at all.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like there's a mystique about Tale of the Tribe because we just have these nibbles to go on, or like a brief outline, but not really anything substantial. Well, tell me, like, now that your book is done, like, I imagine you learned a lot. Like, what are the major takeaways from the book? And 5 bullet points. What's the book about?
The first section focuses on the influence of Finnegan's Wake on mass Illuminati.
Okay.
I find it interesting. T.S. Eliot and many others have said that one should read Joyce chronologically. So the only way to read Joyce is to start with his book of short stories, Portrait, Ulysses, then Finnegan's Wake. I did it backwards, and this book is sort of structured backwards in that I became obsessed with Finnegan's Wake, said, boy, I really should read Ulysses. Then I read Dubliners, and then I read Portrait, and then I've come back to them many, many, many times. So my life as a Joycean has been immersed in Finnegan's Wake. So that I had Finnegan's Wake study groups from 85 till 2021. So for 36 years, I had Finnegan's Wake study groups. And so that was constantly feeding me. I approach Ulysses in a variety of ways throughout the book. Portrait, I focus really on there's a sermon in The Earth Will Shake, where Sigismundo has this hellfire sermon that's very clearly based on the hellfire sermon in Portrait of the Artist by Joyce. So I really focus on those two, and also look at some things that Bob Campbell published in an interview decades ago about influences on Portrait. And then I use the short stories in Dubliners as a scaffolding for a big section, but because Joyce said that paralysis was central, and paralysis plays such a central role in the Illuminati theory of history. Then the final section of the book comes from our study group of Prometheus Rising. And so I'm looking at doing the exercises in Prometheus Rising, focusing on how Joyce permeates that book.
Mm.
And how, so like, it's like coming at it from two angles. One, Joyce is so important to Wilson, and so I'm looking at that through his whole life work. And then from the other side, for the last 24 years of Bob's life, he kept pointing back to Prometheus Rising and saying, he said, these are the exercises. This is what it seems to me. You know, even in quantum psychology, he points back to Prometheus Rising. And so that's where I was struck when we talked about doing a Prometheus Rising study group. I said we should take like 7 years to do it. And, you know, people said, no. So how about 23 months? Okay, that seemed way too long for most people. But it's like really digging into that. And for me, knowing that I was using this to finish my book, I wanted to really take anything Joyce has mentioned in that book and really blow it up. And it also proves as a diary of living through the pandemic and living through America in that time and trying to really take those exercises seriously.
Mm. So I guess would you say there was a direct Joycean influence on Prometheus Rising?
Absolutely.
Wow.
It seems to me that it's like Joyce is there in everything Wilson says and does in his life.
Okay.
From the age of 20, maybe 17. Joyce is one of those fundamental, and he kept coming back to Joyce over and over and over again. And so when he did his PhD dissertation, and then he wants to turn it into a book, and he really says, I want this to be a book that's sort of where Dr. Leary and I are and how we think the world is. In many ways, it's like Tale of the Tribe. It was, I think, and I also, in 98, his revision of that, he went back through and really sort of brought everything that was important to him into that book, I think. And
Mm.
so Joyce shows up over and over and over again. And there are things like apply the Leary grid to Leopold Bloom. You could spend a lifetime doing that. And it's interesting. I know I think that you tend to prefer the Leary order of metaprogramming is 6 and morphogenetic or whatever else you're going to call it, 7th.
Yeah.
Explicitly in Finnegan's Wake, he says Beethoven is the language of the Sixth Circuit. Finnegan's Wake is the language of the Sixth Circuit. So that for him, his understanding of the brain, of humanity, is very much linked in with his love of Beethoven and Finnegan's Wake.
Hmm.
And so he's coming at it intellectually from the Third Circuit mode. Joyce is always there for him. And he's saying, and it's something if you look at Leary's mid-70s writing, he's saying, I think we've, as a society, the hippies, whatever, have really explored whatever the Fifth Circuit is. And you see in What Does Woolman Want in other books, he's sort of saying, I don't know what comes after this. I'm being very speculative. There's a wonderful note in Flashbacks where he says, when we're talking about these circuits, we don't know. We haven't done the research. They've made this research illegal. We should be very, very tentative about this. And for Wilson, it seemed that he thought whatever, in quantum psychology, he calls it the morphogenetic circuit, but dealing with this dream stuff, Wilson found the tools that Joyce developed the most useful for saying whatever's going on in dreams, whatever's going on in these altered states of consciousness. He found stuff useful in Pound, stuff that was useful in Crowley, but I think that he thought Finnegan's Wake, one time he said, he didn't like the Bible or the Quran. He says, only things I would think of taking for a holy book would be the complete works of Shakespeare or Finnegan's Wake.
That's excellent. I guess what comes up for me here is we talk a lot, but there's a lot of talk about maybe logic, and that's just putting things on probability scales at its simplest form. And I don't even know what the name of it is. I like to think about it as neurological relativity, but it's like our nervous system creates a subjective perception of reality such that we're all seeing things differently. And that's where I get from Ulysses, I think it's Ulysses, where it's like everybody's seeing the same day in a different way. And that's Prometheus Rising. He's like, hey, put yourself in the headspace of a Republican and now put yourself in the headspace of a Democrat. And just trying to get this point of neurological relativity across. So in that regard, to the extent that's a Joycean thing, I can totally see how that dominates, or maybe dominates isn't the right word, but just so deeply influences Bob.
And it's interesting. Today marks Mozart's birthday, also Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I remember Bob was talking at the Prophets Conference in '97 in somewhere outside of Phoenix. And we were talking about one can read Ulysses as a commentary on the Holocaust, even though it appeared in 1922, years before, because Joyce hammers home the absurdity of anti-Semitism in that book.
Mm.
And so one can read it almost as if, Joyce is looking at the incredible horror of anti-Semitism. Interestingly, because his friends T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound both really succumbed to anti-Semitism. And, and Ulysses, as you said, you've got everybody seeing the world in such different ways. And he creates that in that text. And it illuminates it. And again, I love that you have the matrix behind you, these texts function in that way.
Yeah, yeah. When I write my Eighth Circuit book, I think it's going to be unplugging from the Matrix, um, if such a thing be possible. Well, let me think here. Do we cover all 5 points of, or 5 bullet points, or kind of an
I,
overview?
I think so, in the sense that I try to deal in the book with all of, when I started the book, it was like dealing with all of Joyce and how that affected Wilson. And
Yeah,
then I said, well, I'm going to look at this one particular work of Wilson's through a Joycean filter.
right.
So as I try to, I really, I deal with lots and lots of stuff that Wilson wrote, but I most heavily deal with Mass Illuminati and Prometheus Rising.
I would have never guessed Prometheus Rising. That's so cool.
What strikes me is how many little articles and things that Wilson has a pointer to Prometheus Rising.
Yeah.
If you want to understand this, do the exercise. If you want to understand this, do this. And so many essays he wrote in the 80s and 90s, he would point back to it. And I used quantum psychology in a couple of college critical thinking classes. And I was struck by, even in there, he points back to Prometheus Rising.
Hmm.
And so I found this interesting that you're discussing with Bobby. I love Prometheus. I love quantum psychology, but even there, he gives priority to quantum psychology. I'm
To,
going back. He
yeah.
gives priority to Prometheus Rising. He points back and says, and I love how he tweaked Prometheus Rising in the rewrite. Because I think in the early 90s, he got really into E prime. And I find it interesting that I decided, like, January of 98, I said, I'm going to translate Prometheus Rising into E prime because I didn't like all the is's in there. I just start this, and I'm at Borders bookstore, out of business now. And there's a Prometheus Rising that says revised second edition. And it's like he didn't put it into E prime, but he like took everything he had learned in the 90s to take that book and just make it, I think, much better.
Hmm. Yeah. I I think I want to, I don't know, feel compelled to clarify for what it's worth that I think the thing about Prometheus Rising for me is that it's Leary's eight circuit model. And I've said this in the past. I don't know if I've said it on our podcast, this podcast, but all along the Watchtower, it's, everybody thinks that's a Jimi Hendrix song. It is a Jimi Hendrix song, but it was written by Bob Dylan. It's a Bob Dylan song. And even Bob is like, that song belongs to Jimmy now. Now, I don't think Leary would ever, uh, Leary, to be frank, feels a little egocentric, so I don't know that he would give it away so much. But, or maybe he has. I see your, but point being that I think really
Yeah.
Bob took the model and ran with it, like Jimi Hendrix took All Along the Watchtower and ran with it. Where uh, quantum psychology is kind of like Bob's own thing. It's got maybe logic and neurological relativity, and it's his thing versus Leary's thing. So,
You, two things. One, Leary in Design for Dying says he thought Bob did a better job explaining the eighth circuit model than he did.
oh,
And it's somewhere
good
else
for
that does that.
Tim. Good for
Yeah.
Tim.
Tim, it's interesting. Back when I published Moon Blue Apples, I had 4 different people write reviews of a Tim Leary appearance, okay, to get 4 different viewpoints
Oh,
of
yeah,
it.
yeah.
And, he seems like a very complicated fellow.
Yeah.
He could be so wonderful. And when I published that issue, Moon Blue Apples, Bob Wilson wrote back, Tim could be a mean SOB sometimes. You know,
Yeah.
he had to be tough to live through what he lived through.
Yeah.
And
Right.
the other thing is the idea of masks. One might see that Wilson would use a Leary-esque mask, uh, just as in Mass Illuminati, he puts on the mask of Ezra Pound and Einstein and Crowley and Joyce. Bob loved the essay by Oscar Wilde called The Truth of Masks, which Bob
Mm.
always called the reality of masks. But at one level, it seems like an essay about costumes in Shakespeare. But Bob said it clearly could deal with being gay in Victorian England. Or one can read it as existing as Irish under Imperial British rule. Or all of us with the masks that we wear to function. And again, I found it interesting in post-COVID terms, in terms of the masks that many of us wore. And so I think Bob deeply invested himself in the Eighth Circuit model. And even later in his life, when he didn't write as much about that model, he still I seem like living proof that the exercises in Prometheus Rising don't work.
Oh,
You know, I'm no Buddha. I've spent thousands of hours doing those exercises. But he says at one point in Prometheus Rising, these exercises seem to loosen the imprints. And
yeah.
that seems to me true. That they can shake up your way of seeing things, and shake up, you know, the realities that you perceive. And I love how he, you know, this incredible recursion in that he tells you to rebut the whole book. Say that this whole book is a waste of time. And I think that may be Michael Johnson's favorite part of the book, right? His tear into Wilson. And from a Christian perspective, and say, well, how terrible he is. And nobody should read them. Nobody should read Finnegan's Wake. Nobody should do E-Prime. I really enjoyed that. Okay. And so I think he enjoyed having these masks that just turn inside out.
I don't want to be too critical of Bob, but I think my criticism is that Bob was a heady guy, and I tend to view him as the Third Circuit Grand Supreme Master, as a writer, as an intellectual. And the exercises to me feel very intellectual. And what I mean by that is, like, it literally, I think 50 to 75% of the exercises are put yourself in this headspace and then put yourself in the opposite headspace. And to me, that is a Third Circuit exercise. Um, you want to say something? Go ahead. That's just kind of my thing.
Sure. My guess is, I've wondered about this for years, Mr. Gathers. They just, exercises did not work for you very well. The exercises that you've tried from that book. Yeah.
I just feel like I get it. When we were posting back in the heyday of altfan.ra Wilson,
Mhm.
I went through a good year or two of doing that in E Prime, and I did all my posts in E Prime. And that was probably the most impactful Bob Wilson exercise, made a huge impact on me. That hammered home neurological relativity for me. And that, to me, I don't feel like I need to do necessarily the Prometheus Rising exercises, because I got it. I get there's a Democrat headspace. I get there's a Republican headspace. And I'm not saying I haven't done the exercises. I'm just saying I feel like I got it. But to me, it's a Third Circuit exercise. It's challenging my conceptual models of the world.
And that seems reasonable. It seems to me that I have not gotten it yet, and that I've had enough of it. I may never do those exercises again, but I feel like, you know, I've learned a lot from it, but I still don't know why he wants us to look for quarters. And I find it interesting how inattentive I am so much of the time. You know, in Ireland, you have the minor birds that say,
Attention.
here and now, here and now, be here now, Ram Dass says. Oh, I did have the notion once of translating "be here now" into "e prime" and calling it "seen here now," but
Yeah, so I guess to me the quarter exercise is that exercise in attention, and it's like when something new crosses your mind. I don't have a concrete. Like a new car comes out, and suddenly you start seeing it everywhere. But it's because your mind is kind of it's like 23s to a certain extent. When you start looking for them, you find them. Um, what there's the I think it's scarlet begonias. Once in a while you get shown the light in the strangest of places when you look at it right. And to me, that's about synchronicity in a way. And I think synchronicities are out there all the time. It's just if we're in a flow state, so to speak, where we pick up on them, they happen for us, or we just happen to be in a place where we notice them. If and to me, that's the quarter exercise is like, hey, if you want to put your attention into finding quarters, you will manifest quarters. It's almost like, oh, as cringe as this is, just that manifestation, like The Secret, or I forget what the other movie is, but just,
yeah.
if you want to put your energy into manifesting positive, you're gonna get more positive. We, my family and we went on a vacation recently, and it was full of challenges. And I tend to dwell on the challenges. So somebody asked me how the vacation went, and I'm like, man, it was a circus. We had this, X, Y, and Z. Geez, there's a Freudian slip. My wife, um, how was it for you? Oh, it was great. We had
Yeah.
this, and that. I'm like, man, it's like we went on two totally different vacations. Uh, Go ahead.
Oh no, I didn't mean to. But when interesting coincidences around Tim Leary appearing in town, and once he came to town the same time Bob was in town,
Mm,
not going to schedule. So we took Bob to hear Tim. And I was sitting there with Steve Snow, who's a producer, TV producer, and he did a wonderful interview with Bob that's on YouTube. Um, and Bob said, how this compared with the last time you heard Tim. And Steve said, "Oh, it's terrible. They're like half the same stuff." And I said, "Oh, it was great. Half of it was new material."
right. Well, tell me, now that the book is done, how is your understanding of Wilson or your understanding of Joyce? What did you get out of the book in making it?
Incredible sense of gratitude
Mm,
to these two men for creating these machines. Bob Wilson said he thought that Ezra Pound in the Cantos and Leary in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake wanted to create the internet on paper.
right.
So in some ways, these are incredible magic machines, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and the Cantos. And so for them to spend so much time, and go again, Pound had to, I mean, Joyce had to go against Pound. So many people thought Finnegan's Wake, you're going in the wrong direction. Pound thought that, but he wanted to do this thing and he did it and he created it. I remember reading somebody on the internet some years ago blaming Bob Wilson for Luna's death and saying that if he hadn't quit Playboy, he wouldn't have been living in such a poor neighborhood. But
Mm,
Wilson was willing to go out and create these incredible machine books to help us navigate what the fuck is going on in 2025. I love the original three volume version of Schrodinger's cat so much. Um, he was going through that incredible pain after Luna's death, and navigating, Ronald Reagan becoming president and whatever else. Um, and he created these things for us. Another thing I thought was interesting came up with you and Bobby talking. So we're all doing this patchwork. We've all sort of done these different things based on our experience with Bob Wilson's work. that you're doing these wonderful podcasts. Bobby's doing all these different things he's doing. Michael Johnson's doing, he's doing, Oz and Pop Kennedy with his new biography. We're all going in very different directions, but spinning out from this work that Leary did, that Ezra Pound did, that Bob Wilson did, and so I feel grateful that these things exist, even though I may never read Finnegan's Wake again. I don't know. I may never read Prometheus Rising again. Who knows? Somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, we're going to start a Finnegan's Wake study group." I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." But I sort of feel like I'm done with it for a little bit.
That makes a lot of sense. I never want to fucking talk about Crowley again. From being on this podcast, I'm done with him.
But like Godfather 3, he keeps pulling me back in.
Yeah.
Having spent a hell of a long time studying Crowley and Crowley's Kabbalah, that's my strong experience of re-imprinting. Getting that out of my third circuit, I've deliberately tried not to read Crowley for the last 20 years, but it's still that framing system that deals with, G, P, that adds to 83. That also says, that's just, once you put yourself through that, it's very, very hard to get my horns through the door.
And I just want to say that's one area where I feel like there's something about memory and connections, and that when you have that Kabbalistic map that you can make connections with, that it's a tool for memory. So now as I'm, creeping into my 50s at the age of 52 here, my memory has been on a slow decline since I was about 25. And I feel like Kabbalah could be one of those areas where I can improve my memory by just having that system of associations. But that to me isn't like dealing with fucking Crowley. It's just...
Well, in Book of Thoth, one of the appendices, he gives these different versions of the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, until you commit this absolutely to memory, you're going to make no progress with the tarot. Okay. Right. He says, you've got to make this part of your life and soul and use it for dealing with everything. And so, I find it really useful to I took a semester of Hebrew in graduate school. These days I love, and again, anybody watching, stay away from Crowley, but if you want to learn Kabbalah, I love that Duolingo has a really nice way to learn the alphabet. And so that's, if you pull up Duolingo,
the Hebrew alphabet, I assume you mean.
Yeah, that they within Duolingo, for languages that don't use our alphabet, they have tools for learning other alphabets that are really cool. Like you draw them on the screen. So like if I pull up the Duolingo Hebrew course here, can we see it here? At the bottom, there's this little aleph. And if you click on that, there are specific exercises for learning the alphabet.
Oh, wow.
And they do that for Arabic, for Greek, for Russian. And then they got different ones for Chinese and Japanese too. But, Israel Regardie made the comment that Crowley knew very little Hebrew, but he used it very, very deeply.
Interesting.
And so you can get the amount of Hebrew that Crowley had rather quickly with that app.
Right. Yeah, it seemed it was more about the symbolism than the actual language, so to speak.
Well, he used it as a filing system for dealing with the world. The same way, as you pointed out, Wilson and Leary used the Eighth Circuit model.
Right.
For Crowley, the tree of life became a way to deal with everything, and 777 details that.
Right. That was the language of consciousness, so to speak, or
or
Right.
a model universe of all these different altered states.
Right.
As you start having these flow experiences or whatever else, dream experiences, drug experiences. Wilson liked different models for these. He liked the Eighth Circuit model. He liked the Crowley-esque model. He liked the Finnegan's Wake model. He used lots of different ways in how do we deal with these altered states of consciousness. Crowley liked to stick them all into the filing cabinet of the Kabbalah.
Right. Well, you brought it up. I'm curious to get your take on this because I'm just not, I don't have the intellectual capacity to make these comparisons. But Schrodinger's Cat was three
Mm-hmm.
volumes, so many hundreds of pages that was trimmed down to fit into one single edition. That's what Bobby and I talked about in the January podcast. Do you have a take on that? What was cut from the book? It was Bob never seemed to complain about that.
Yeah, because he chose it. He did it himself.
Ah, fair enough.
Okay. He went through and maybe I have not gone back through this. I taught a class at Maybe Logic Academy 2009 or so, 2010 on Schrodinger's Cat, and I used the one volume edition because it's so much easier to come to. And I like it okay. It's not like I don't feel like as with Prometheus Rising, he made the text substantially better. For
Right.
me, I think Schrodinger's Cat, he made the cuts that the publisher wanted. He added a few little things, but I don't feel like, in all honesty, I think I find the original version a transcendently wonderful work of art, and I
Mm,
like the one volume version.
wow,
But it's
that's
like yeah. For me, he's dealing with the deepest suffering of his life at that point, and he
mm,
created Schrodinger's Cat as an fu to the universe, saying, "No, I'm going to come out of this an optimist."
wow. Wow. That's it's kind of a shame. It's really just hard to find the three volumes separately.
This is anybody who wants to can do. I mean, how expensive are they right now?
What's that?
How expensive are they? I haven't even looked. Are they like
I
$100
I
each? Yeah.
I
And
bought them on eBay years ago
yeah,
just to
yeah.
have them.
Whoever it is, if you want them that badly, read the one volume version, and it'll come around. So and again, that's what I fell in love with when I was 20. So
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
it could just be me. I'm thinking about the Yacht Rock original web series. The last episode of it is so much like the end of the Homing Pigeons. And I don't know if they read the Homing Pigeons, but they have this whole thing where they're in outer space and they need to use smooth music to fight the aliens that are coming out of the black hole. And it does a switcheroo with the character early on that's very similar to the switcheroo that Bob does with George Dorn at the end of Homing Pigeons. And it could just be a coincidence, but I don't know if any of those guys read Bob.
Yeah. Well, okay, so while we're on this subject of sorts, do you feel that was it Dan Brown who wrote the
Yeah, yes, yes.
yeah, what's the name of the movie slash book?
Da Vinci Code. Da
Da
Vinci
Vinci Code.
Code.
Do you think
Yeah,
do you think Brown read Wilson?
yeah.
You do.
Oh
Like
gosh, yeah.
okay.
But they both read Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And I think Holy Blood, Holy Grail won a lawsuit against him.
Oh, really? That I mean,
Yeah.
after reading Holy Blood, Holy Grail, I could totally see the connection, but sometimes I wonder if it's wishful thinking to think that Bob Wilson influenced Dan Brown.
And I could be wrong. It's like I feel sure that Pynchon read the historical Illuminati series when he wrote Mason and Dixon.
Wow.
And other people have seen, they think there's a reference to Keep the Lasagna Flying in Bleeding Edge by Pynchon.
Huh.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, we maybe haven't talked about Joyce as much as we could. That's tell me about Michael Johnson's piece.
So he went through. And he like, for years, I've been saying, I want Mike to write a rebuttal to my book.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And got him to write this wonderful piece where he goes really deeply, just sort of chronologically looking at everything Wilson said about Joyce going back to the 50s. And I just found myself working on the back cover blurb for the Hilaritas book. And I said, I like the way that his book and his essay, it's like a 100-page essay, right? 80-page essay. With my book, I think works synergetically to just sort of show the incredible centrality of Joyce to Wilson's worldview. And so, and so very scholarly work that Michael did, digging to see all these different references to Joyce. And so, and that provides a wonderful, and again, I don't want to speak for Mike, but I think he's, that he says there's no way anybody cannot see that, yes, Wilson learned from Joyce tremendously and honored Joyce tremendously. One thing that strikes me, Joyce, Bob Wilson liked the Joycean Sheldon Breivik, and Shelley died during the pandemic, unfortunately. I was lucky enough to meet him 14 years ago at the North American James Joyce Conference. And what struck me in Breivik's last couple of books on Joyce, so many things that are coming up in contemporary Joyce and stuff make me think of stuff in Schrodinger's cat. There's stuff like very much like the multiple worlds model. They call it something different, but it's like a lot of these, it seems like a lot of the new ideas in Joyce studies in the last 15 years, Bob did ahead of time. But he doesn't get, he doesn't get the credit because I was struck, a lot of Joyceans, I think, are aware of Bob, like him, but they don't take him seriously.
Right. I could see that, I guess. Why do you think that is? I mean, I have my intuition about it, but
At one level, he is very unfashionably optimistic. His background in physics, engineering, and math is just different than people who have a background in humanities. He emerged out of hippie culture and science fiction culture and new wave culture, all of which get so little respect. It's like I'm struck by how much Phil Dick has entered and Lovecraft have entered into the academy, but they don't have this cosmic optimism that Bob had that just runs absolutely counter to I love the New York Review of Books. I hesitate to call it the New York Review of Books reality, but that sort of cosmic optimism doesn't get you tenure. I don't think. In my, I'm deeply ignorant about these things, but that's how it seems to me.
okay. It seems to me that Bob's association with like fringe psychedelics, quote unquote pseudoscience, just kind of lends to people not taking him seriously.
But it's like academics love hallucinogens now. They love pinching, but they love Phil Dick and Lovecraft, but I think that Leary and Wilson are just too well. In '85, I went to the Ezra Pound Centennial, and Allen Ginsberg, Bob Creeley were there. They were both 59 at that time, younger than where I am now. So time has passed. And there were all these guys from Harvard and Yale, college professors around 20 years younger. But Ginsberg was such a child. He was so inappropriate, saying you should stand in front of the White House with a sign that says Reagan is a shit, as opposed to these old men in 39-year-old bodies with their nice ties coming from Harvard and Yale with a career. And the poet Robert Graves, in his introduction to his book Love Story, said the closest people in our time come to their bodies is when they go through adolescence, and that they're writing horrible love poetry and they're living with their body changing. He said poets are people who never get past that. They're still awkward 14-year-olds. And I think that, certainly Ginsberg and Creeley had successful careers, but Bob still had that cosmic optimism where he would go out and say things that pissed off the Prophets Conference, so they fired him because he was using 4-letter words, you know.
Well, that's something I've just never considered, that how the optimism has made him unpopular.
And I don't know that that's true, but there's something, I know people, wonderful novelists who love Illuminatus, but they don't. I think a lot of them were turned off by Schrodinger's cat.
Hmm.
A lot of people who hippies and academics, people who liked, Bob Campbell, who was talking to me, said he talked to so many people who read Illuminatus and dug it, but then it's like, oh my God, he's taking these ideas seriously, that we can go to outer space and live forever. That just, the idea of people really still mock a lot of that sort of utopian
Yeah.
thought.
Well, I follow like the health, wellness, and longevity space pretty fairly closely, especially certain people. And there's a guy, Brian Johnson, who is a multimillionaire that's gone down this longevity path to an extreme, and his whole philosophy is don't die. And so at the core of it is just immortality. And that guy gets more hate in 2025 than you can. It boggles my mind. He's a weird dude. He's an ex-Mormon, and he's just kind of got his eccentricities. But man, he is like one of the most hated people in the space. But he's like, look, if we're going to take this health and wellness longevity thing to the extreme, let's not die, immortality. And it just stirs people. I mean, that was the thing about Bob Wilson when I first met him. That was the first thing I ran into, not met him, but when I first encountered Bob Wilson, the first thing I ran into was immortality. And it was like, whoa, that it rockled me. I can't deal with that. I had to come back years later and, wrestle with it.
And I'm struck by, you still see people in their 20s on television saying, man, we're all going to die. That's an absolute fact.
Right,
It's
death
like,
and taxes.
whereas and again, what I learned from immersion in Joyce and Wilson is I don't feel certain about much of anything.
Hmm.
And so maybe, yeah, I'm probably going to die. Yeah, I can see that. But, who knows?
Well, certainly that idea that, science is going to extend our lives 20 years, and within that 20 years, we could get another 20 years, and then we could get another 20 years, and that we could be. I mean, Bob put that out there years and years ago, but it seems like we're at a point now where that actually could be reality.
It seems so reasonable to us, but as you said, that just fucking no, no.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
think a lot of the people that are really shaken up by that seem to be deeply religious, and it's like only God lives forever. We're mortals. We're not allowed. That's just not. You can't think that way. It's just taboo. Um, so I could see that where it just really just shakes their whole belief system to the core. I mean, it did me. I was really like, whoa. Okay, so I want to just keep going back to Joyce a little bit, but if I heard
who?
Joyce, James
No.
Joyce
Oh, okay.
is a 20th century writer you may have heard of. Um, it sounds, or I guess more specifically, it sounds like Michael Johnson kind of wrote kind of like a point counterpoint to your, is that fair to say?
It I think one can read it that way, but it didn't. I just loved the idea. I've been calling it a rebuttal in my mind for like 3 years as I've been nudging
Okay.
him to want to do this. He's so kind, and he just he basically, you, I, him, a lot of us white men who love Bob Wilson, have been sort of pushed in certain directions, but we've been pushed in very different trajectories. And so he took his formidable intelligence in reading and used to look at the question of Bob Wilson and James Joyce. And so it comes out with a Michael Johnson flavor.
Yeah.
Okay, which I think is really cool to go along with my text, which has an Eric Wagner flavor, which is not to everybody's taste. But I love hopefully the way the two will work together so that
Yeah.
people can say,
So I wasn't thinking of it as like more of a debate style, but
yeah,
more like whenever you and I talk, we have a lot of Grateful Dead references, and I feel like the audience is groaning, but so be it. But like Bob Weir talks about, after the first few years of being in the Grateful Dead, he felt like he did the rhythm guitar thing about as far as he could take it. And he started studying Coltrane and, or maybe it was
Bartok.
just the point and counterpoint that the saxophonist had with his pianist.
Yeah,
And how so he started playing counterpoint to Garcia's point, tried to anticipate where Garcia was going, tried to meet him when he get there, and then give him a little twist when he got there. And that's more what I had in mind when I was talking about you and Michael Johnson, is just coming at it from two different angles and weaving together. Maybe that's a little much for some Joyce essays, but for the folks listening, Michael wrote an extensive essay that is part of your book. And it sounds like, from what I've heard from Rasa, I haven't seen the book, but it sounds like it works really well. And it sounds like you would agree with that.
absolutely. And a cool, I think it's a cool story. Man, this is like 88. Bob Wilson's in Phoenix giving a talk. And I'm talking about the imagined meeting writers from history. And I say, I imagine, Dante and Pound at the bar, sorry, about sitting down arguing about the techniques of Italian versus Latin poetry. And Bob said, yeah, and I'd be at the bar with Joyce. And that's the cover image that Rasa came up with and I never told him that story, but
Mm,
it's exactly of Bob and Joyce at the bar. And I really liked that.
nice. Well, we've covered a lot of bases here. Anything specific you'd like to add about your book? Uh,
I hope people like it. It's like I feel like Rip Van Winkle, that I started working on this a quarter century ago, and here I am, and it's like, oh my God, I've gotten old. The world has
Never want to read
changed.
Joyce again.
I You and I talked about that when we did our Beethoven thing. It's like I keep coming back to Beethoven, but I've had enough Joyce for a while.
Yeah.
But I could go. I haven't really delved into Joyce except to finish this book up for over a year. I could easily succumb, but I feel proud of the book, and I hope that people like it, especially people who like Bob Wilson.
Yeah. Nice. Well, as someone that has struggled to penetrate Joyce, and I just don't feel like I have that literary mind, I do look forward to reading this. So,
Thank you. And Joyce thought everybody could read Finnegan's Wake. He said, if you like cricket, you'll find stuff about cricket. If you like, whatever it is you like is there. If you like sex, there's lots of sex. If you like bathroom jokes, there's lots of bathroom jokes. Finnegan's Wake has got everything. It's got the weather.
yeah, and the one thing I guess we didn't touch on that I had in my mind is how it helps to study it or read it in a group setting. Um,
Yeah, and in Prometheus Rising, which I bought in March of '85, he talks about having a Prometheus Rising study, having a Finnegan's Wake study group.
Yeah.
And I had like gotten Finnegan's Wake out of the library in '83. I bought my first copy in '84, didn't have much success with it. Oh, I said, I've been to Bible study groups, big, difficult tests that none of us have read all cover to cover. I'll just do the same thing with Finnegan's Wake. I invited everybody I knew. We did it on Thursday nights because I had lied to my job at Dairy Queen that I had a class on Thursday nights so I could stay home to watch Hill Street Blues. Okay. And so Thursday became Fin Days for most of the next decade. My friend Conrad came, my roommate Robert came. A few years later, when Bob Wilson was in town, he came. I put up flyers in bookstore, a wonderful writer named Steve Williams, who came for years. I advertised in the local New Age paper. Okay, so people responded to that. So we had different people. Then I started teaching high school, and I had Finnegan's Wake Club there for 23 years.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
there, and so, it was cool because some kids really got into it. And it's
Mm.
like one time I had a group of 10th graders said, "Can we finish the whole thing before we graduate high school?" So yeah, we're gonna do 8 pages a week till you graduate. We'll do it. And so some of them like dropped out, but then just before they graduated, we did the last page and everybody showed up. We had a room full of people doing the last page back to the first page,
Oh,
you
wow.
know? So I would like start it over again with each new group of kids. And then I had another few years ago, kids who just got really into it. And we just had a room full of people doing Finnegan's. In fact, they wanted to switch it to Fridays because they like calling it Thin Fridays. And so, it's Bob Wilson said, the best way to study Finnegan's Wake is out loud. Even better is to do it out loud in a group with a 6-pack of Guinness Stout. And as the amount of alcohol in the bottles goes down, your comprehension goes up.
Maybe that's what's been missing in my life. Well, and I know Bob had a study group every week for forever, and I don't know how much of that was Finnegan's Wake and how much of that was other things. I think it evolved over the years.
I never went to that, but people like Mimi Peleg and a number of other friends of his went there, and I know that they did a lot of different books.
Yeah.
They did the Cantos, they did Finnegan's Wake, but Bob and I mostly corresponded by mail and then by uh, uh, email, and then we ran into each other a bunch of times, where I would go to hear him speak. Anytime he was in or he was in Arizona, I would see him. And then when I moved back to Southern California, I got to see him a number in '98, '99, and 2000.
Yeah. All right, one more question, and this is on my mind. Terence McKenna had a lecture, one of his more popular ones, on Joyce. What is it? Riding Range with James Joyce, or no, Surfing Finnegan's Wake. Riding Range with
Yes.
Marshall McLuhan. It was like a two-parter. Riding Range with Marshall McLuhan, which I've listened to a number of times and never felt like I understood McLuhan anymore. And Surfing Finnegan's Wake. Have you've listened to that, I assume. What's your take on Terence's take of Joyce?
I don't remember,
Okay.
but I do think, and again, deadheads, man, that period from 72 to 74, I think is really fascinating. You've got July 23rd, 73 with Bob Wilson and Sirius. You've got Wayne Benner and Tim Leary in jail dealing with their stuff. You've got Thomas Pynchon publishing Gravity's Rainbow, Ishmael Reed publishing Mumbo Jumbo, Doris Lessing publishing the Sirius Notebooks, Phil Dick going through his wild stuff from 71 to 74, and the Grateful Dead having their greatest years from 72 to 74. Something was going on, and they
Mm,
were all tuning into it and getting their different flavors. In
yes.
Schrodinger's Cat, Bob talks about Aleister Crowley contacting Aiwass and Charles Dodson contacting Lewis Carroll, and that Crowley stuff got a Crowley flavor, and Charles Dodson stuff got the Alice in Wonderland flavor. So whatever people were picking up on in that period, I think is really interesting. And again, Rafiv Zabor's book, Iowa Benzi, deals with a group of people studying Sufism in England about the same time. There's wild stuff going on there that we haven't come to terms with. David Halberstam, in his book, The Best and the Brightest, in introduction to a new edition of that came out a few years ago, called the 1960s the Second American Civil War. And in many ways, the divisions, I think some people think there's divisions in America today, but you can trace those divisions back to the divisions of the 1960s. Okay, and that came to a certain peak with 72 through 74. There was a book on the 60s by Tom Brokaw where he sort of said the 60s really started in 63 and ended in 74. Although Rafiz Zabor says no, 60s ended when Bobby Kennedy was killed. So again, you can model it lots of different ways. But so McKenna is also right in the heart of that with him and his brother in South America. And so that for me, when I think I brought this up to you before, but McKenna was one of those guys who invented the whole 2012 thing.
Right.
And for me, as a somewhat arrogant Wilson head, I sort of felt like I understood the world. I would smile, man, this is where we're going. These are the trajectories. 2012, ever since then, I'm like, wow, no, this is not the world I imagined. The world is not going in the directions I thought it would. Although the guy who seems to have got closest to getting it right seems like Bob Heinlein. When Bob Heinlein in the 40s designed his future history series, he called where we are right now the crazy years.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. The more I got aware of Terra 2 and Starseed, there was a part of me that was like, how come that didn't get blended into Eric Davis's High Weirdness book along with Dick Wilson and McKenna? But it's also, I think, just so kind of, Leary seems really coy about what the hell was going on with them in Starseed. Like, it's just really, there's not a lot to go on, but it does seem like that corresponded with everybody else's experience. And you've just given me a dozen more examples of what happens in that 72 to 74 era.
And this is where there's so much in Bob Wilson's work. And that's where it's so cool that you're talking to all these people who go off in so many different directions. What Antero was doing, what other people are doing. That you can Wilson's work as a springboard in so many directions, just like Joyce. The academics like to think that they own Joyce, but there are so many people outside of English departments who love James Joyce, painters and filmmakers. Richard Linklater, the director, has so much Joyce in his work. Just like, on the Grateful Dead groups on Facebook, they get so excited to see somebody wearing a Grateful Dead t-shirt, all over the place. We are everywhere. You find Joyce marked so many people because he made such powerful tools for trying to deal with the world around us. And so lots of people have come to Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and Portrait and Dubliners and said, oh, this helps.
This helps. Let's end it with that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Eric. Always a pleasure chatting with you. Oh, I like that one. And well, when this releases, your book will be out, and I imagine that'll be pretty satisfying. So I look forward to giving it a read. So, and we have another podcast that you and I recorded August of 2024, and I hope to have that out this spring as well. But we'll.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you again. I know you put a lot in this book. I know you put a lot into the other podcast. I appreciate you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to Eric for taking the time to chat. Thank you, as always, to the Robert Anton Wilson Trust, and thank you to Richard Ross of Hilaritas Press for editing, production, and all-around awesomeness. My next episode with Eric Wagner, yes, that's right, Eric Wagner, will release as usual on the 23rd. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et Hilaritas. Hilaritas.